John Wayne called Dean Martin a drunk in front of 300 people. Dean's response put him on his knees. Los Angeles, 1970. A packed ballroom, a live microphone, and the most powerful man in Hollywood decides to humiliate another legend in public. One sentence could destroy a career, or ignite a reckoning no one expected. Dean Martin stands up anyway. Where are you watching from? What he did next rewrote the room. The Biltmore Hotel Ballroom in March 1970 was not just a dinner. It was a scoreboard for old Hollywood. 300 guests gathered to honor the Western, but everyone was also quietly counting who still mattered. At the head table sat John Wayne, newly crowned by an Oscar, broad shoulders squared, voice already filling the space before he spoke. Across the room, Dean Martin laughed easily with Robert Mitchum and director Howard Hawks, looking comfortable in a world that punished comfort. In this era, reputations were currency. One careless moment could freeze casting calls, turn studio doors cold, or follow a man for years. Wayne understood power, and he wielded it openly. When he stood to speak, waiters paused, forks hovered, and the band softened mid-note. He didn't need to name names yet. The room could feel where his words were aiming. Dean felt it too. The subtle shift, the way conversations thinned, the instinctive glance toward him before anything had been said. He set his glass down, not to make a statement, but to steady himself. In this room, silence could be interpreted as guilt, and dignity could evaporate faster than applause. Westerns celebrated men who stood their ground. Tonight, that test wasn't on film. It was happening live. Wayne began exactly as expected, praising the Western as America's moral backbone, a genre built on honor, discipline, and real men doing real work. People nodded, relieved to recognize the script. But his tone carried an edge, like steel wrapped in nostalgia. He spoke about preparation, about showing up sober, trained, and ready. Each sentence landed heavier than the last. Then he shifted. He dismissed pretty boys, singers who pretended to be actors, performers who relied on charm instead of craft. The smiles thinned. Dean didn't react. Years in nightclubs had taught him that reacting too early gave control away. At his table, Mitchum stiffened, and Hawks leaned forward, already uneasy. Wayne's gaze swept the room, slow and deliberate, before locking onto Dean. The pause was theatrical, cruel in its precision. Everyone understood what was happening. A lesson was being delivered. If Dean stayed seated, the story would spread by morning. He took it, because he had to. If he stood, he would be challenging the biggest star in the room, a man whose shadow reached into every studio office. Either choice carried consequences. Dean felt the weight settle in his chest, calm but unmistakable. This wasn't about pride. It was about whether he would allow a lie to define him in front of the people who decided who belonged. When Wayne finally said the name, Dean Martin, the room seemed to exhale and then freeze. He called Dean a drunk playing a drunk, a man who slurred his way through westerns on hangovers and charm. Plates went untouched. Glasses stopped midair. You could hear the low hum of the air conditioning, steady and indifferent. Mitchum muttered a quiet curse. Hawks reached out and touched Dean's arm, a director's instinct to stop a scene before it burned down. "Don't," he whispered, because he knew how fast this could turn ugly. Dean looked down at his hands for a brief moment, as if checking that they were steady. Then he stood, not abruptly, not angrily, just calmly, the way a man rises when he's made a decision. Wayne tried to turn it into spectacle, calling him up, framing it as bravado. Dean answered softly, "Yeah, Duke, I do," and started walking. The crowd parted without being asked. Every step was measured, unhurried, almost gentle. He wasn't marching to fight. He was moving to be heard. By the time he reached the stage, the tension had shifted. This was no longer Wayne's monologue. It had become a conversation everyone knew could change everything. Standing beside Wayne, the contrast was unmistakable. Size, volume, reputation. Wayne loomed, used to winning by presence alone. Dean didn't try to match him. He spoke quietly, forcing the room to lean in. He asked a simple question about the work, about the role in Rio Bravo, about whether playing broken was easier or harder than playing perfect. Wayne scoffed, doubling down, repeating the accusation like a verdict. Dean listened without interrupting. Then he explained, not defensively, but precisely. He talked about understanding pain, about portraying a man who fell apart and had to find his way back. He spoke about preparation, about professionalism, about knowing the difference between a persona and a person. The words didn't attack, they clarified. Hawk stood up and corrected the record, voice firm, defending Dean's conduct on set without hesitation. Applause rippled, hesitant at first, then stronger. Wayne faltered. For the first time, he looked unsure, not because he was being shouted down, but because he was being exposed. Dean finished by asking for something simple, truth. Not victory, not humiliation, just truth. The silence that followed was heavier than any insult. In that pause, everyone understood the power had shifted, not through force, but through restraint. Dean's past had trained him for moments like this long before Hollywood did. Years of nightclubs taught him how silence could command more attention than noise, how timing mattered more than volume. He learned to read rooms filled with drunks, executives, skeptics, and fans who thought they knew him before he opened his mouth. That training shaped his instincts now. He understood that Wayne's attack wasn't really about him. It was about fear, fear of fading relevance, fear of a changing industry, fear that toughness alone no longer guaranteed respect. Dean didn't say that out loud yet. He let Wayne reveal it himself. As the room watched, Dean held steady, refusing to become the caricature being thrown at him. Every measured word reminded people of something they'd quietly known, that ease could be discipline in disguise, that effort didn't need to look like struggle to be real. Wayne bristled at that implication, shifting his weight, fists tightening, because the argument wasn't being won on his terms. He couldn't overpower this moment with size or certainty. Dean wasn't asking permission to belong. He was stating, calmly, that he already did, and that distinction mattered more than any insult. Wayne pushed closer, voice rising, insisting heroes mattered more than vulnerability. The crowd felt the heat of it, the old formula clashing with something newer and harder to dismiss. Dean didn't retreat. He asked another question instead. Why fear weakness if audiences responded to honesty? Why dismiss range as softness? The questions weren't traps, they were mirrors. Wayne didn't like what he saw. Hawk stepped between them briefly, not to end the exchange, but to anchor it in fact. He stated plainly that Dean had been professional every day on set. No hangovers, no excuses, just work. The applause this time was unmistakable. Wayne looked out and realized the room was no longer his. He tried to reframe, to say he'd been making a broader point about Hollywood, but Dean gently cut through it. That wasn't a point, he said. That was personal. The words landed cleanly. Wayne hesitated, something rare enough to be visible. In that hesitation, power slipped. Dean wasn't humiliating him. He was giving him an exit, an opportunity to step back with dignity. Whether Wayne would take it was now the only question anyone cared about. For a moment, it looked like Wayne might refuse. Pride held him upright, jaw tight, eyes scanning for allies that weren't there anymore. The room waited, breath suspended, aware that escalation could turn this into something ugly and irreversible. Dean stood still, hands relaxed at his sides, signaling he wasn't afraid of silence. That calm unsettled Wayne more than shouting ever could. Finally, he spoke, haltingly, admitting he'd been wrong about some facts. It wasn't a full surrender, but it was a crack. Dean didn't pounce. He pressed only where it mattered, asking for accountability, not submission. You called me a drunk, he said. That was false. The clarity left no room to argue. Wayne tried to justify it as hearsay, as stories, and Dean answered evenly. Stories weren't facts. He flipped the power again by reversing the lens, asking how Wayne would feel if rumors about him were aired publicly as truth. That question did what accusations couldn't. Wayne had no answer. The crowd sensed it immediately. The imbalance had tipped. This wasn't about winning anymore. It was about whether Wayne could reclaim respect by choosing humility over dominance. When Wayne finally apologized, the words seemed to surprise even him. Gasps rippled through the room, followed by applause that carried relief as much as approval. The apology wasn't polished. It was awkward, incomplete, human. Dean accepted it without ceremony, extending his hand and shaking Wayne's firmly, signaling closure rather than triumph. The tension drained out of the ballroom in waves. Conversations resumed, but softer now, altered by what everyone had witnessed. Back at his table, Dean sat down and exhaled, the delayed weight of adrenaline settling in. Mitchum clapped him on the shoulder. Hawks hugged him, pride clear in his eyes. The dinner continued, but the hierarchy had shifted. People glanced toward Dean not with curiosity, but with respect. He hadn't shouted. He hadn't insulted. He'd corrected a lie and protected his dignity in front of the most intimidating man in the room. Outside later, under the streetlights, Wayne approached him again, not as an icon, but as a man. He admitted jealousy, fear, and exhaustion with a changing world. Dean listened, recognizing the same anxieties he carried himself. Their conversation was quiet, honest, and unfinished in the best way. Something had ended inside that ballroom, but something else, more lasting, had begun. Word of the confrontation spread before the valet brought the cars around. In Hollywood, silence never lasts long. By the time Dean drove home, phones were already ringing across town, assistants whispering, agents calculating, friends replaying the moment in their heads. Some versions grew sharper with every retelling, but the truth stayed simple. Power had been challenged without spectacle. Dean understood escalation wasn't over yet. Reputation rarely settles immediately. The real test would come in how Wayne handled the days that followed, whether the apology held or hardened into resentment. Dean didn't gloat. He didn't call reporters. He returned calls with the same sentence. "We talked. It's done." That restraint mattered. It told people this wasn't a feud to monetize. It was a boundary drawn and respected. Meanwhile, Wayne wrestled with what had happened. For decades, intimidation had worked. This time it hadn't. The realization followed him into interviews, onto sets, into quiet moments he usually filled with certainty. The fear Dean had named, the fear of being left behind, kept resurfacing. Others noticed the change. Crew members said Wayne listened more, paused longer before speaking. The confrontation had done something unexpected. It slowed him down. And in slowing him down, it forced him to look inward, a place he'd avoided for most of his career. The official story broke the next morning. Trade papers framed it as dramatic, but dignified, focusing on the apology rather than the insult. That detail mattered. Public perception shifted quickly when humility entered the narrative. Wayne hadn't doubled down. Dean hadn't retaliated. Studios took note. So did actors who'd spent years navigating unspoken hierarchies. For many, the moment became proof that the old rules weren't unbreakable. Dean moved on, returning to rehearsals, to recordings, to the steady rhythm of work. He didn't feel victorious. He felt relieved. Defending yourself carried a cost, even when done cleanly. Weeks later, Wayne addressed the incident in an interview, acknowledging he'd spoken from frustration. It wasn't eloquent, but it was sincere enough. People noticed. The industry adjusted its posture, subtle but real. Younger actors cited the exchange as evidence that respect didn't require aggression. Older ones reconsidered how loudly they defended their territory. The ballroom incident became shorthand for something larger, a changing definition of strength. Not the absence of fear, but the willingness to admit it. Dean recognized the irony. By standing up once, quietly, he'd shifted conversations he'd never intended to start. Years later, when Wayne faced his mortality, the memory of that night resurfaced in unexpected ways. Illness stripped away bravado, leaving questions no role could answer. He called Dean, not as a rival, but as someone who had seen him clearly and still offered respect. Their conversation wandered through fear, regret, and the strange weight of legacy. Wayne admitted he was terrified of dying, of being forgotten, of losing the identity he'd built on toughness. Dean didn't reassure him with platitudes. He normalized the fear, calling it human rather than weak. That distinction mattered. It gave Wayne permission to stop performing. In those moments, the ballroom confrontation revealed its deeper impact. It wasn't about humiliation or dominance. It had opened a door Wayne later walked through willingly. The man who once equated strength with control now listened, absorbing a different lesson. Vulnerability wasn't surrender. It was honesty. That honesty softened him in his final years. Friends noticed it. Family felt it. Dean carried the weight of those conversations quietly, aware that growth often happens far from spotlights. The real reconciliation hadn't happened on stage. It happened later, in private, when pride finally loosened its grip. When Wayne died, the tributes focused on his legacy as an icon, but those who knew the fuller story remembered the shift. They remembered a man who learned late, but genuinely. Dean attended the funeral without spectacle, sitting back, letting others speak. Afterwards, Wayne's son approached him with gratitude, explaining how much their final conversations had meant. Hearing that, Dean felt the last thread of that long-ago tension finally release. Time reframed everything. What once seemed like a public clash now looked like an inflection point. The industry remembered the headline, but the people involved remembered the growth. Dean never corrected the exaggerated versions. Legends didn't need footnotes. What mattered was a lesson that endured. Power loses its edge when met with calm truth. Strength isn't proven by who you silence, but by who you listen to. The ballroom night had tested both men. One learned to speak with restraint. The other learned to hear it. And in that exchange, something rare happened in Hollywood. Two icons left a conflict better than they found it. In retellings, people often focused on the insult, but those who were there remembered the response. Dean's genius wasn't in a cutting line or a clever comeback. It was in refusing to play the role Wayne assigned him. By staying calm, he denied Wayne the fight that would have justified the attack. He reframed the moment as a question of truth versus assumption, professionalism versus rumor. That shift flipped the power dynamic in real time. Wayne, used to dominating rooms through volume and certainty, found himself responding instead of commanding. The audience sensed it immediately. They weren't watching a takedown. They were watching authority recalibrate. Dean's restraint forced Wayne to confront something deeper than pride, his fear of losing relevance. And because Dean didn't weaponize that fear, Wayne could acknowledge it without collapsing under it. That was the real reversal. Power moved away from intimidation and toward integrity. People later said Wayne looked smaller that night, but not because Dean humiliated him. He looked smaller because he stepped down from the pedestal he'd climbed alone. Dean didn't push him. He simply held the ground steady long enough for Wayne to step off safely. The crowd's reaction sealed it. Applause wasn't loud at first. It grew cautiously, as if people were testing whether it was allowed. Then it spread, filling the room with approval that felt earned rather than forced. Some applauded Dean's courage. Others applauded Wayne's apology. Most applauded the relief of seeing conflict end without destruction. In an industry fueled by grudges, this restraint felt radical. Studio executives exchanged glances. Actors recalibrated what standing up could look like. Authority figures noticed that dignity carried its own gravity. Wayne absorbed it all quietly, nodding, accepting the shift without protest. It was the first time many had seen him relinquish control without resentment. Dean returned to his seat not as a victor, but as a man who'd closed a door that needed closing. Conversations resumed, but they were different now. Less performative, more reflective. People spoke softer, as if aware they'd witnessed something instructive. The room didn't celebrate conflict, it absorbed a lesson. That was Dean's final move. He let the moment teach itself. In private afterward, Wayne admitted what the room had already guessed. He was tired. Tired of pretending certainty came naturally. Tired of guarding an image built decades earlier. Dean listened without interrupting, understanding that confession required space. Wayne spoke about jealousy, about watching others adapt while he clung to a formula that once worked flawlessly. Dean didn't challenge him. He normalized the fear, saying everyone in the business carried it, even those who made success look effortless. That admission leveled them. Two legends, neither immune to doubt. Wayne asked how Dean handled it. Dean answered honestly, by working hard quietly and refusing to let fear turn him cruel. That line stayed with Wayne. It reframed strength as restraint rather than domination. The handshake they shared afterward wasn't ceremonial. It was mutual recognition. Not agreement on everything, but respect earned through vulnerability. The confrontation had ended hours earlier, but its real resolution happened here, away from applause and witnesses. Power wasn't seized. It was shared. In the months that followed, subtle changes appeared. Wayne's interviews softened. He credited actors he once dismissed. He paused before criticizing a world he no longer fully controlled. Those who knew him best recognized the influence. He'd learned that authority didn't require tearing others down. Dean never took credit. He continued working, letting time do what arguments couldn't. When people asked him about the night, he answered briefly, refusing to immortalize the conflict more than necessary. The industry, however, remembered. Younger actors cited the moment as proof that dignity could withstand power. Veterans saw it as a reminder that legacy wasn't fixed, it could evolve. The tension that once defined the story dissolved into something quieter and more lasting. When Wayne later acknowledged Dean publicly as better than people give him credit for, it wasn't damage control. It was recognition. The power struggle had ended not with one man kneeling, but with both standing on equal ground. The final tension broke quietly, not with headlines, but with consistency. Wayne's behavior stayed changed. That mattered more than any quote. Crew members noticed he asked questions instead of issuing orders. He listened, sometimes uncomfortably, as if learning a new language late in life. Dean watched from a distance, careful not to intrude. He understood something crucial. Growth collapses when it's monitored too closely. Respect had to breathe. When they crossed paths again at industry events, the exchange was easy. Nods, brief words, no residue. The absence of bitterness confirmed what many hoped. The apology had been real. In Hollywood, where grudges often outlive careers, that alone felt remarkable. People stopped framing the night as a clash and started calling it a turning point. Not because Wayne had been defeated, but because he had chosen differently. Dean's role faded into the background, exactly where he wanted it. He'd never aimed to rewrite hierarchy, only to correct a lie. Yet correction had consequences. Authority learned it could be questioned without chaos. That realization lingered, subtle but enduring. Privately, Dean reflected on how close the moment had come to spiraling. He knew one sharp remark could have ignited applause and destroyed any chance of reconciliation. Restraint had been a risk, not a guarantee. But he believed dignity worked best when it refused to perform. The later phone calls with Wayne confirmed it. Those conversations were slower, heavier, filled with admissions neither man would have made publicly. Wayne spoke of regret, of years spent equating fearlessness with worth. Dean spoke of learning to live with doubt without letting it harden him. They didn't solve anything abstract. They simply spoke honestly, and honesty did what force never could. It built trust. The incident receded into memory, replaced by something steadier, mutual respect. When illness came for Wayne, those conversations mattered. They gave him permission to be afraid without shame. Dean carried that knowledge quietly, understanding that the most important parts of a story often happen after the audience leaves. After Wayne's death, the story resurfaced with renewed gravity. It wasn't retold as gossip anymore. It was cited as evidence of change. Wayne's family shared how much those later talks had meant to him, how they softened his final years. Hearing that, Dean felt the last weight lift. The night at the ballroom no longer felt unresolved. It had become part of a longer arc: conflict, correction, growth. In interviews years later, Dean framed it simply. Adults argue. Adults listen. Adults apologize. That simplicity cut through myth-making. He resisted language about victory or humiliation. There had been none. Only a boundary defended and a man met where he was. Time did what time does best. It stripped away theatrics and left meaning. Younger generations heard the story not as Hollywood drama, but as instruction. Stand up without cruelty. Speak truth without spectacle. Leave room for others to change. By the time the story settled into legend, its sharpest edges had dulled, revealing its core. It was never about putting anyone on their knees. It was about helping someone stand differently. Dean's response became shorthand for a kind of strength Hollywood rarely celebrated: quiet, precise, unafraid of pause. Wayne's apology became proof that even the most immovable figures could move. The industry remembered the lesson longer than the insult. Power didn't have to roar. It could listen. Years later, when people spoke of Dean's legacy, they mentioned the ease, the charm, the music. Those who knew the fuller story mentioned something else: character. He understood that how you answer an attack defines you more than the attack itself. That night in March 1970 wasn't a climax. It was a hinge. Two paths opened. Both men chose the one that led forward. And that choice, more than any role or award, was what endured. This wasn't a story about winning. It was about choosing dignity when humiliation was easier. If this moment moved you, like the video, subscribe for more human stories, and tell us, when have you chosen grace over retaliation?